The early years of World War II saw Nazi Germany dominate Europe. By the end of 1941, as Adolf Hitler continued to build his empire, events in the Pacific took on their own momentum as Imperial Japan and America became locked in battle after the bombing of the US naval fleet at Pearl Harbor. As the smoke and flames rose from the naval base in Hawaii, America and its president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, could no longer remain on the sidelines of the war that had been waging in Europe for over 2 years. And on December the 7th, 1941, the hostilities were transformed into a global conflict.
A state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
This would mark the beginning of a new chapter in the Second World War, where the Americans joined the fight for what Roosevelt had laid out as the 4 freedoms. The first was freedom of speech. The second, freedom of religion and expression. The third, freedom from want. And last but by no means least, the fourth was freedom from fear. The story of how the nation, which so treasured its neutrality and had gone to such great lengths to avoid fighting on foreign soil, joined the war, will follow in the footsteps of Roosevelt, the man responsible for the American dream. Born on January the 30th, 1882 in Hyde Park, New York, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the son of James Roosevelt and Sarah Ann Delano, who both came from wealthy and well-established families of New York State. On his mother's side, Franklin was descended from a French pilgrim who'd begun the perilous journey from England to America, sailing alongside the Mayflower. Delayed by problems en route, Philippe de Lannoy finally set foot on American soil in 1621. 2 decades later, Claus van Roosevelt, the ancestor of James Roosevelt, sailed from Holland to arrive in Nieuw Amsterdam, or New York as it's known today. The Roosevelts were a powerful family, and Franklin lived a privileged life, studying at one of America's most highly regarded universities, Harvard. During his time there, at the beginning of the 20th century, his 5th cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, was made President of the United States in 1901. He quickly became a hero and role model to the younger Roosevelt, who was inspired by Theodore's strong leadership. Soon after his cousin stepped into the White House, Franklin met Theodore's niece, Anna Eleanor Roosevelt, who he would eventually marry in 1905. Eleanor gave Italian and Jewish immigrant children dance classes on the Lower East Side and tried to show Franklin the more deprived side of American life. It was something the future president never forgot, and together the couple would eventually make immense changes, improving the way many poor people lived. 6 years after marrying Eleanor, Franklin followed in his cousin Theodore's footsteps and ran for the New York Senate, and after a successful campaign, entered the State House at just 28 years of age. When Woodrow Wilson appointed him Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1913, Roosevelt began a lifelong association with the Navy and became an enthusiastic advocate of the submarine, which was now proving crucial in combating the new threat to shipping which came from Germany. World War I broke out in 1914, but it wasn't until 1917 that America entered the conflict. President Wilson had been keen to preserve peace and was reluctant to subject Americans to the horrors of trench warfare, which was fast becoming a gruesome reality. This would all change by 1917 when the president received a telegram informing him that the Germans were attempting to coax the Mexican government into a military alliance against the United States, with the promise of having Texas, New Mexico and Arizona restored to them. After many sleepless nights, President Wilson concluded that there was no other option but to send American troops into battle, and on April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany, much to the relief of the British. Winston Churchill, who was the first Lord of the Admiralty at the outbreak of war, had commented that, "There are only two ways of winning the war, and they both begin with an A." America was of course one, and the other was air power. It would take a year for the United States to muster the strength and resources to take part in the action. But by the summer of 1918, thousands of American soldiers were being sent to France every day, and became vital in helping the Allies push the Germans off French soil and into a surrender. It was at this time that Roosevelt had the opportunity to visit the Western Front and Great Britain. And on July the 29th, 1918, the 36-year-old Roosevelt first met Winston Churchill, by then the Minister of Munitions, at a banquet in Gray's Inn, London. The meeting was not a pleasant one for Roosevelt, who later recalled Churchill's rude behaviour towards him, saying he acted like a stinker, little imagining how their relationship would develop in later years. Just over 3 months after Roosevelt's visit to Britain, Germany surrendered, and the world rejoiced as the armistice was signed on November the 11th, 1918. But by this time, millions of lives had been lost. Among the casualties of war were over 100,000 Americans, with over 200,000 wounded, leaving the people of the USA feeling that in future European politics should be left to the Europeans. As the United States settled once more back into peacetime, Franklin D. Roosevelt now had a major battle to face on the domestic front. Eleanor, his wife, had discovered he was having an affair with his social secretary, Lucy Mercer, and by 1917 she'd moved with their 5 children into a separate house in Hyde Park. They overcame the scandal, and as Lucy suspended her relationship with Franklin, Eleanor stayed a loyal and supportive wife throughout his career, going on to become a key figure in American politics herself. As the Roosevelts settled their differences, the post-war years saw a boom in American industry, and the roaring 20s made the country a glamorous and exciting place to be. With a thriving economy, many people could now afford luxuries such as radios and cars, and the world was tantalized by the incredible new addition to the American landscape, Hollywood. As new innovations in filming techniques made movies bigger and better than ever before, the country boasted a huge array of celebrities, and the public clamoured to see the latest shows on Broadway and in the movie theatres, giving stars such as Rudolph Valentino iconic status. Of course, there was a bleaker side of life, with the prohibition of alcohol giving rise to gangsters and an underworld of crime, and many criminals became as famous as the stars that graced the silver screen. Despite the prosperity and economic wealth in America, the decade would prove a tough one for Roosevelt, because in 1921 he contracted polio while on holiday at Campobello Island with his family. He suddenly found he could no longer walk and dedicated the next 7 years to all kinds of therapies to help him fight the disability the condition left him struggling with. Eleanor was again forced to fight for husband, as her mother-in-law, Sarah Delano, believed her son would now be an invalid for the rest of his days. But both Roosevelt and Eleanor refused to accept the paralysis as permanent, and fitting his hips and legs with iron braces, he taught himself to walk a short distance with the help of a cane or an aid.
In not having to carry about 10 pounds of steel round on the bottom of my legs.
His determination was so strong that when he ran for public office in 1928, his supporters had no idea that the politician privately used a wheelchair. But just as Roosevelt fought his way into office and was elected governor, the United States was on the verge of a sudden change in fortunes, when the most devastating stock market crash in history shook the nation to its very foundations. The Wall Street crash of October 1929 marked the beginning of an era of instability, which would affect the rest of the world. Unemployment rocketed, millions became homeless, and as the Great Depression loomed at the end of the glittering 1920s, it had a powerful impact on Europe, not least Germany, a country already in economic turmoil, after being ordered to pay huge sums of money in reparation to the victors after being held responsible for starting World War I. And it was against this dramatic historical backdrop that Roosevelt ran for President of the United States in 1932. And although America was not literally at war, Roosevelt confronted the economic challenges of the era as a military commander would his enemy. I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people. This is more than a political campaign, it is a call to arms. The New Deal was a series of schemes that sought to combat the economic crises and inspired the American people all the way to the voting booths. In 1933, a triumphant Roosevelt stepped into the White House as president and began working towards providing relief to the poor, the reformation of the financial system, and helping economic recovery. He introduced the Social Security system, which still exists in the United States today, and did all he could to improve the desperate situation. Unfortunately, Roosevelt was not the only new leader to turn economic challenges to his political advantage, and thousands of miles from the west coast of the United States, German citizens were listening avidly to the words of a passionate new leader, Adolf Hitler, who not only promised economic salvation, but the punishment of those he believed responsible for the miseries of Germany's subjugation after the First World War. Unlike Roosevelt and his altruistic measures, Adolf Hitler primarily sought self-promotion and revenge. He blamed the Jews and the communists for the downfall of Germany, and began rallying a force of belligerent and violent Nazis to fight for their extermination. At the time, these activities across the Atlantic in Europe went largely unnoticed by the vast majority of Americans, but it wouldn't be long before they would find themselves facing the horrors of war along with the rest of the world. Even at this early stage, unrest was becoming more evident on a global scale, especially when the Italian dictator Mussolini occupied Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia, in 1935. A year later, when fighting in the Spanish Civil War was at its height, Congress was keen to assure the American public that they wouldn't be dragged into an overseas conflict, which is why the Neutrality Act was passed. Also, unemployment dropped and the economy began to stabilise, and as a popular president, Roosevelt successfully campaigned for a second term in 1937. However, it wasn't too long before international conditions worsened yet further, as the Japanese invaded China, and as the enemy soldiers approached Shanghai, American civilians began to leave the Chinese city in droves. Roosevelt sent reinforcements and aid to China, and on October 5, 1937, as the battles raged beyond the Pacific, he made a speech that was rather at odds with America's isolationist stance. He said, "The peace, the freedom and the security of 90% of the world is being jeopardized by the remaining 10%, who are threatening a breakdown of all international order and law. We are determined to keep out of war, yet we cannot insure ourselves against the disastrous effects of war and the dangers of involvement." The speech was far from neutral in tone and suggested that for Roosevelt, if a cause was worth fighting for, it would have his support. By 1938, as the European climate became increasingly unstable, the Nazis began to expand their territory, seizing Austria, the Rhineland and Czechoslovakia with barely a hint of opposition from Britain or France, who were still recovering from the devastation of the First Great War and were in a total quandary over what to do about Adolf Hitler. The main goal of the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain was to maintain peace in Europe at all costs, but as time went on, this seemed increasingly difficult to achieve. Unfortunately for Roosevelt, Chamberlain was also rather anti-American in his views, regarding people from the USA as brash and ill-mannered, and as Chamberlain declined several invitations to the White House, relationships between the two nations slowly deteriorated. Ironically, Chamberlain was far more at ease talking to Adolf Hitler, and as he made his way to Germany to discuss appeasing the Führer, the first Nazi rally was broadcast to millions of Americans. The sound of the German leader shrieking to the regimented Nazi faithful, who responded with thunderous cries of Sieg Heil, was extremely alarming, and Roosevelt was of the opinion that war was imminent. Only 2 months later, even more shocking revelations would reach America when reports of the imprisonment and murder of countless Jews during the Kristallnacht, the Night of the Broken Glass, in November 1938, were made public. Many were outraged, and Roosevelt made a public statement saying, "The news of the past few days from Germany has shocked public opinion in the United States. I myself could scarcely believe such things could occur in the 20th century." As the world reeled from the Nazis' persecution of the Jews and Hitler's arrogant dismissal of the laws set up by the Versailles Peace Treaty 2 decades earlier, Roosevelt sought to discover Hitler's real aims. In April 1939, he sent Hitler a telegram asking him to assure the world that he had no plans to invade 31 listed countries, asking why the Nazis could find no better method of realizing their destiny than those which were used by the Huns and Vandals 1500 years earlier. A copy was also sent to Mussolini, and the message was broadcast to the people of America as Roosevelt hoped he could sway public opinion in favor of intervention. Hitler's response was a furious 2-hour speech denying any intention of attacking other nations, and he dedicated a considerable amount of time to a vicious personal attack on the president. It seemed clear Hitler was not to be trusted, but at the time there was little that Roosevelt could do other than watch and wait. Despite rather frosty relations between the American president and the British Prime Minister, Roosevelt sought to improve public relations when he invited King George VI and Queen Elizabeth to America in June 1939. The charming royal couple did a considerable amount to raise British popularity in the United States, visiting New York's World Fair and the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier from the First World War. The King, accompanied by Roosevelt, laid a wreath to commemorate the terrible loss of life the 1914-18 conflict had been responsible for. But beneath the smiles, both men were all too aware of the threat Adolf Hitler was posing. As the royal couple left for London, the president wished them all the luck in the world. But just a mere 11 weeks later, Great Britain would be at war. On September 1st, 1939, in the early hours of the morning, Roosevelt was woken by a call from the American ambassador in Warsaw, bringing the dreaded news that the German army had invaded Poland. With full knowledge of the implications of such a barbaric act from the German dictator, Roosevelt responded simply with the words, "God help us all." 2 days later, on September the 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Germany, and so began a global conflict that would last for 6 long years.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
Although Roosevelt reassured the public that America would remain neutral, he stated that he couldn't ask his fellow countrymen to remain neutral in their thoughts as well. Nevertheless, the people of the USA were still unwilling to intervene in European matters, and although they sympathised with the British and French, they felt it was not their problem.
I say we ought to keep hands off. Let them take care of themselves. You can count me out.
There would, however, be a surprising hope for Anglo-American relations when a familiar character returned to the political scene in the shape of Winston Churchill, who was appointed First Lord of the Admiralty on the day that war was declared. Despite any earlier differences, Roosevelt immediately began corresponding with Churchill, evidently relieved to have found an ally in Chamberlain's government, who was as concerned and proactive in the fight against Adolf Hitler as he was. President Roosevelt's declaration of American neutrality might have ensured that the USA remained isolated from the turmoil across the Atlantic. But behind the scenes, plans were being made. In October 1939, prominent Americans met at Panama to quarantine the New World and create a security zone, which extended hundreds of miles out into sea. The same month, on the advice of Albert Einstein, a much revered scientist who'd fled the Nazi regime for the safety of America, Roosevelt established an advisory committee on uranium. New revolutionary discoveries had been made in nuclear science, and Einstein feared they were within Germany's grasp, which could have devastating consequences for the world. In the meantime, more European nations were falling victim to the Nazi onslaught, and America watched the fumbling policies of the British and French as they attempted to stop the Germans invading Denmark and Norway, while Stalin's Red Army marched into Finland. There was increasing concern as further reports of atrocities against the Jews began to circulate, and the writers John Steinbeck and Eugene O'Neill signed a statement on the deeply immoral treatment of people of the Jewish faith in Nazi Germany, while many others voiced their support for the victims, including the Hollywood stars Fred Astaire and Bette Davis. By June 1940, the Nazis had pushed through Holland and Belgium and into France, and the ineffectual Neville Chamberlain had been forced to resign. On May the 10th, 1940, Winston Churchill was appointed Prime Minister of Great Britain's wartime government, and as Paris fell to the Nazis in the summer of 1940, he called upon Roosevelt for help, warning that the voice and force of the United States may account for nothing if they are withheld for too long. As Hitler turned his attention to Great Britain, Churchill made inevitable requests to America for ammunition, aircraft, and supplies of raw materials, not least after the loss of weapons and vehicles after the evacuation of Dunkirk at the end of May and into early June 1940. Although Roosevelt supplied the British Prime Minister with what he asked for, he still doubted whether even Winston Churchill's stirring speeches could rally the nation to withstand Hitler's Nazi war machine. In the end, it was Churchill's decisive action at Oran when the French fleet was bombed to avoid the naval force falling into German hands that really impressed Roosevelt, and he responded by offering Churchill 50 destroyers in exchange for 99-year leases on British bases in the Caribbean and Newfoundland. However, although the president was willing to lend a helping hand, the rest of America still wasn't convinced. Charles Lindbergh, the famous American aviator, inventor and explorer, and the first airman to fly non-stop from New York to Paris, was a leading spokesman for the anti-war movement America First, and fiercely advocated keeping the USA out of European battles. He'd visited Germany in the 1930s several times to report on aviation and the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, and even accepted an award from its commander, Hermann Göring. Lindbergh believed that a crusade into Europe to destroy Hitler would lay the continent at the mercy of Stalin's Soviet Russia, in his view a much greater threat, and ultimately lead to the destruction of Western civilization. He was not alone, as many prominent businessmen, famous authors and public figures supported the cause, including Walt Disney and the actress Lillian Gish. Even the future President of America, John F. Kennedy, sent a telegram of support to Lindbergh. Roosevelt was convinced Lindbergh had Nazi sympathies and ordered a thorough FBI investigation of the popular hero, but nothing incriminating was ever found. While Roosevelt battled against public opinion, Hitler now sent the might of the Luftwaffe to attack the British Isles. Millions of Americans were gripped by the drama unfolding thousands of miles away by keeping up with the news daily through radio broadcasts. The American journalist Edward Murrow played a huge part in bringing the Battle of Britain and the Blitz into America's living rooms, as he reported on the action amidst the roar of exploding bombs and wailing air raid sirens. He broadcast his dramatic accounts from London's rooftops and at street level, even recording the footsteps of civilians as they rushed to the bomb shelters. At a time when nobody could be sure whether they would survive from one day to the next, "So long and good luck" became the standard parting greeting of the British, and this was soon incorporated into Murrow's programmes as he ended each broadcast with the poignant words, "Good night and good luck." Americans were visibly moved by Britain's plight, and public opinion slowly began to turn. There were those who were not prepared to wait for a change in American foreign policy, and they risked everything to join the fight for freedom long before such selfless service was actually asked of them. Between June 1940 and December 41, several hundred Americans volunteered to join the RAF to help defend the island nation during the Battle of Britain. Fighter pilots, navigators and air gunners faced a 10-year prison sentence, the loss of US citizenship and a $20,000 fine for breaking American law Many of these brave volunteers would declare themselves Canadian to avoid discovery. Many died in battle and would be among the few that the British owed their lives to. While the British fought on, Roosevelt began to make preparations back home in America with the Selective Service Act. All males between 21 and 36 were required to register. However, over 6,000 local draft boards would make the final decisions on fitness and any claims for deferment. While queues formed and men were examined, Roosevelt attempted to appease the anxious public, insisting that he would not be sending Americans into a European war, assuring them that this was being done in preparation for the defense of their nation. This was a time when the president couldn't afford to fall out of public favor. After all, he had an election to win. After 2 terms in office, Roosevelt was pursuing his 3rd term, an unprecedented political move in American presidential history. Out of 48 American states, Roosevelt was victorious in all but 10, and as 27 million people voted him back into the White House, he began his historic 3rd term in November 1940. As Roosevelt continued to preside over Congress, he was still determined to help Britain, conjuring the image of the United States as a great arsenal for democracy. The uplifting speech he made in the new year of 1941 became identified as the embodiment of the American dream. In the State of the Union address, he proposed that the world should be founded upon 4 essential human freedoms, namely the freedom of speech and expression, the freedom of every person to worship God in his own way, the freedom from want, and the freedom from fear. A world which incorporated these freedoms, Roosevelt believed, was the very antithesis of the so-called New Order of tyranny, and were principles that would always be worth fighting for, whatever the cost. Roosevelt was very quickly given the opportunity to play his part when just 1 month later, Churchill made an impassioned plea to the Americans: "Give us the tools, and we will finish the job." In response, in March 1941, Congress passed Roosevelt's Lend-Lease Act that aimed to do precisely what Churchill had asked. By this time, Britain had been fighting relentlessly for 9 months and was in desperate need of supplies. The Secretary of War, Henry L. Stimson, told the Senate that, "We are buying, not lending. We are buying our own security while we prepare." The Lend-Lease policy would prove invaluable to the Allies in the fight against Nazi tyranny, and within months was also extended to the Russians as Hitler turned on Stalin. By mid-1941, the United States were committed to the Allied side with all aid short of war, and as US convoys were sent to protect Allied shipping, and US naval aircraft carriers secretly began ferrying British fighter planes between Britain and Mediterranean war zones, the conflict was without doubt escalating on a global scale. Also, while Europe and America were drawing up the battle lines, Japan became a more threatening force in the southern hemisphere, and consequently there were dramatic changes in American foreign policy. As the Japanese invaded French Indochina, the route for US aid to China was in danger of being cut off, and American land deep into the Pacific was being surrounded. The collection of islands known as the Philippines had been part of American territory since the defeat of the Spanish at the end of the 19th century. A historical meeting between Roosevelt and the newly appointed President Manuel Quezon had established a new Filipino government in 1935, which would claim independence by 1945. However, while Japan edged ever closer, the tiny nation was at grave risk of being attacked, and the action that Roosevelt took to stop the Japanese in their tracks would set in motion a series of events that would alter the course of the war. In July 1941, Roosevelt ordered that all Japanese assets in the USA be frozen, a policy that was soon followed by Britain and the Netherlands, making it virtually impossible for them to buy oil, an essential raw material for their expansionist policies. Purchases from America made up 95% of the oil essential to the growth and maintenance of the Japanese Empire, and not surprisingly, the news was greeted with horror in the East, and a further meeting between Roosevelt and Churchill alarmed them even further. On August the 14th, 1941, the two great leaders of the Allied forces would finally come together face to face, with any differences between them from the past very definitely put aside. "At long last, Mr. President," exclaimed Winston Churchill as he shook Roosevelt's hand. It was their first meeting since 1918, and it marked the beginning of a great friendship between the two men. The 4-day meeting aboard a ship anchored off the coast of Newfoundland was devoted to an agreement on war aims, and the result was the Atlantic Charter. This historic agreement stated that, amongst other issues, no territorial gains would be sought by either the United States or the United Kingdom, and Churchill was evidently very respectful of Roosevelt on this occasion. The British Prime Minister said, "I felt I was in contact with a very great man, who was also a warm-hearted friend and the foremost champion of the high causes which we served." Even so, the meeting did not herald America's entrance into the war as Stalin and Churchill had hoped, although in effect for the Japanese, the Atlantic Charter, combined with the restriction of their oil supplies, was considered to be nothing short of a declaration of war. As Japan faced the reality of this threat to their very existence, in September 1941, an imperial conference was held in Tokyo, attended by the emperor and other dignitaries. Adolf Hitler was certainly keen to pursue his goals in Europe, but anything that distracted the Americans from becoming immediately combatants was helpful. Without doubt, Hitler certainly goaded the Japanese into conflict with the Allies, encouraging them to attack British-occupied Singapore and India with the aim of distracting America from Europe and focusing their attention on a Pacific war. Consequently, Hitler was duty-bound to commit to declaring war on America if Japan took this course of action, and ironically, it would prove disastrous for him. Hitler was of the opinion that America, with its prominent pro-Nazi personalities like Lindbergh and a population keen to preserve neutrality, would not cause him a problem, but it was a serious miscalculation. Nevertheless, America's peace negotiations with the Japanese confused the German ambassador, who was unsure as to whether or not they were genuine attempts at avoiding war. The USA offered Japan a final peace deal, with the promise of embargoes on oil and steel being lifted in return for withdrawal of Japanese troops from Indochina. President Konoye offered to meet Roosevelt in Hawaii, despite the considerable risk to his life. He even went so far as to make a pact with America, under which Japan would agree not to declare war on the United States, even if American activities led to war with Germany, in contravention of the tripartite pact between Hitler, Mussolini, and the Japanese. But Konoye's attempts were all in vain, as the Japanese military were determined to go to war. On December the 7th, 1941, Japan dispatched notification that recognized all negotiations between the two nations had failed. But by the time it arrived at the White House, Roosevelt and the people of America were all too aware that peace with the Japanese was not an option. At 8 o'clock in the morning of Sunday, December the 7th, as the sun shone lazily over Hawaii, high above the Pacific, a sinister shadow began to form along the horizon as swarms of Japanese fighter planes began to approach the US fleet at Pearl Harbor. Before any of the sailors could take up defensive positions, the calm was shattered by a horrifying roar of explosions and swooping planes as bombs, torpedoes and bullets laid waste to the American naval force. Amidst the chaos of smoke and gunfire, thousands of military personnel and civilians were killed. Roosevelt could finally lead the Americans into the war, and there has been speculation since that the attack was not altogether a surprise for the president when news of the carnage reached him. By the next morning in Washington, thousands had gathered outside of the White House, waiting for the reaction of Roosevelt to the terrible attack. The president's words would go down in history, as did the event itself, and he didn't disappoint the Allies, rallying his arsenal of democracy to take up arms against the empire of the rising sun.
And dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
On December the 8th, Roosevelt stated that the United States had suddenly and deliberately been attacked by the naval and air forces of Japan, and no matter how long it would take, he declared that America would defend itself to the uttermost, making certain that this form of treachery would never again pose a danger to the USA. Roosevelt's bitterest opponents were now in favour of fighting, and the nation, which had carefully nursed its neutrality for so many years, stood united behind the president as America entered the Second World War.
The coming battles on the continent of Europe and the Japanese on the continent of Asia and in the islands of the Pacific.
Yet even as Roosevelt spoke, thousands of miles away, the Philippines suddenly came under attack from the Japanese, and it fell to Field Marshal Douglas MacArthur to lead American and Filipino soldiers who fought side by side to defend these strategically important islands. Allied with Japan, the Axis Pact now drove Germany and Italy to declare themselves at war with America on December the 11th. And as the USA stood up to be counted on the Allies' side, Churchill was eager to visit Roosevelt to discuss war strategies. Just days before Christmas 1941, the two great leaders would meet once again, and within the White House, Churchill busily created his own war room, plastering the walls with maps, while the corridor began to fill with British administrators. During the Arcadia Conference, Roosevelt and Churchill carefully planned their next moves, which included an informal alliance between the USA, Great Britain, China, and the Soviet Union. The main objectives were to halt German advances in Russia and North Africa, launch an invasion of Western Europe with the aim of crushing Germany between two fronts, while also saving China and defeating Japan. Christmas Eve 1941 would be the only occasion that Roosevelt and Churchill would speak from the same platform, united in their desire to fight for a free and decent world, and to remember the sons and brothers who serve in our armed forces on land and sea, near and far, those who serve for us and endure for us. Fine sentiments indeed. But in the Pacific, the fight was relentless. Hong Kong surrendered to the Japanese on Christmas Day, quickly followed by Manila, the capital of the Philippines, although bitter fighting continued over the next 4 months. The Japanese also began to approach Malaya and the Dutch East Indies at alarming speed. Nevertheless, for Winston Churchill and the British, the entry of the USA into the fray was very positive. As early as January 1942, American soldiers began to arrive in Britain, and this number would increase dramatically over the following years. The American GIs had quite an impact on British life, as they arrived bearing gifts for the ladies, most notably stockings, and the disgruntled men of the United Kingdom soon began to describe them as oversexed, overpaid, and over here. However, the Americans had a witty response at the expense of the notoriously maverick British commander Bernard Montgomery, describing the Tommies as undersexed, underpaid, and under-Monty. Although many American soldiers were arriving in Britain, the vast majority at this stage were being sent to the Pacific to combat the constant onslaught from Japan. Early in 1942, the Japanese began bombing Singapore, one of the most important commercial and military centres in the British Empire. On February the 8th, 23,000 Japanese soldiers attacked the island. To the horror of Winston Churchill, Singapore had fallen by February the 15th, and the Prime Minister described this tragedy as Britain's greatest defeat. In the Pacific, the American General Dwight D. Eisenhower was doing all he could to get aid to the struggling Philippines, but to no avail. The presidential palace in Manila was occupied, and with 80,000 prisoners of war captured by the Japanese, horrifying accounts of the appalling treatment they received at the hands of their captors soon reached the United States. The Filipino and American soldiers were made to walk 105 kilometers to a prison camp in the north, a trek that has gone down in history as the Bataan Death March. They estimated that about 10,000 Filipinos and 1,200 Americans died before reaching their destination, from hunger, thirst, and torture along the way. And there was outrage back in America as the press reported news of the atrocity. Within months, the Japanese had control of Burma, Malaya, Thailand, French Indochina, and the Malay archipelago. The President of the Philippines and his cabinet fled to set up a government in exile in Washington. While the conflict unfolded in the Pacific, Eisenhower was appointed head of the European Theatre of Operations, and his first task was to put Operation Torch into action. Devised by Roosevelt and Churchill, the plan was to occupy French North Africa, from where attacks could be mounted to drive Italy out of the war. From his headquarters in Gibraltar, Eisenhower directed Operation Torch with attacks on Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, which would be the first combined combat operation during World War II involving American and British forces. It was also where Eisenhower would come into contact with General Bernard Montgomery, known fondly to his men as Monty. By February 1943, Eisenhower had been made responsible for the British Eighth Army, under the command of General Montgomery, and it became clear that tensions not only existed between British and American soldiers, but also at the highest levels. Montgomery exasperated the Americans with his tendency to ignore agreed strategies that didn't suit him, which resulted in him clashing with the US generals George Patton and Omar Bradley. Although General Bradley was polite and courteous, General Patton had a reputation for being equally as difficult as Montgomery, and even his men would refer to Patton by the nickname Old Blood and Guts. In fact, on one occasion, it fell to the level-headed Eisenhower to save the more volatile General Patton's career. While visiting injured American soldiers in hospital to commend the wounded, Patton shocked all who were present by slapping two young privates and accusing them of cowardice. Although their wounds weren't visible, the men were actually suffering from shell shock, which we would recognise today as post-traumatic stress. And when news of the attack was reported, many believed that the general should resign. On Eisenhower's advice, Patton made a public apology to the soldiers before being relieved of duty temporarily, leaving him at liberty to return to the conflict as a vital general in the liberation of Europe as the war progressed towards its conclusion. After success in North Africa, Eisenhower drove the troops into Italy, which soon fell to the Allies. In 1943, Roosevelt and Churchill, recognizing Eisenhower's brilliance, placed him in charge of Operation Overlord, that would include the invasion of Europe, beginning with the D-Day landings. Eisenhower was entrusted with the task of organising around 1 million combat troops and 2 million more men involved in providing support services. As of the 6th of June 1944, the Normandy beaches, codenamed Sword, Juno, Gold, Omaha and Utah witnessed the beginning of the end of World War II. By the new year of 1945, the question was no longer who would win the war. The Allies were by this point poised for victory. It was simply a question of when. However, for Roosevelt, fate was about to play the cruelest of tricks on the man who'd done so much to ensure the defeat of Adolf Hitler and his axis of evil. On March the 30th, 1945, the president went to Warm Springs to rest before his appearance at the founding conference of the United Nations. On the afternoon of April the 12th, Roosevelt was carried to his bedroom, complaining of a terrible headache, and would die later that day after suffering a massive cerebral hemorrhage. Less than a month after his death on May the 8th, 1945, America celebrated with Europe the moment that Roosevelt had fought so hard for, as Germany surrendered. The celebrations of VE Day were dedicated to Roosevelt's memory in the United States, as flags were kept at half-mast for the 30-day mourning period. And Churchill hailed his truest ally as the greatest American friend and the greatest champion of freedom. It was the end of an era, and a new age was about to begin. The man who now took over Roosevelt's battle for the arsenal of democracy was the Vice President Harry S. Truman, who would lead America and the rest of the world into the final chapters of the war. When the conflict in the Pacific finally came to an end in August 1945 with the atomic bombings of the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the West celebrated peace. But the destruction waged on the East heralded a new chapter in modern warfare, as the most terrible weapon history had ever seen finally brought the Japanese Empire to its knees.